Welcome to Haunting History, where buried truths don't stay buried for long. 12 children lived with the Follings. Only 9 were found. The rest? They were never meant to be remembered. This is the family with 12 ghost children. Who were the Follings really? Let's begin. 12 voices, never recorded. 12 names, never registered. 12 children who never officially existed. But they were real, and they screamed. That's how the first agent described what he heard behind the doors of the 3rd floor. The house looked like a painting white porch swing, roses by the gate. But that's the trap. That's always the trap. You think evil lives in shadows. It doesn't. It wears perfume and makes casserole. The Follings didn't just adopt 12 children. They acquired them, quietly, legally, efficiently. And not one of those children had a verifiable past. No birth records, no school transcripts, no immunization history. They were phantoms in the system, shadows in human form. And the townspeople of Millbrook, they looked the other way. Because when people are comfortable, they don't ask questions. But I want you to ask questions. Because what I'm about to show you is not just the story of one corrupted family, it's a blueprint. A ritual, a controlled system of identity erasure and psychological domination that didn't end with the Follings. It just changed form. Howard Folling made his fortune in finance. Margaret was a nurse with a glowing resume. On paper, they were saints. In reality, they built a fortress where children became experiments, and nobody wanted to believe it. Because believing it would mean accepting that evil could live in the house. Next door. The Folling case was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be buried. That's what happens when power protects its own. When the very systems that should defend the innocent become the weapons that destroy them. But they made a mistake. They left just enough cracks for someone to crawl through. This isn't just a true crime story. It's a descent into how institutions, families, and faith itself can become prisons of the soul. You're not just watching this, you're entering. And you won't leave the same. The ghost children of the Folling house didn't haunt that home. They were haunted by it. And once you understand what really happened on that hill in Pennsylvania, you'll start to see the pattern repeating. In your town. In your history books, they called it homeschooling. But what the Folling children endured wasn't education. It was programming. A slow, methodical unraveling of identity done behind lace curtains and Victorian walls, beneath the polite applause of a community too enamored to see the truth. Each child was assigned a color, not a name. Margaret called it order, James was blue, Elizabeth was yellow. The others red, green, gray, violet. Until all 12 had then coded. Their birth names were forbidden. The past was severed like a limb. In this house, history didn't exist. Only obedience. This is how cults are built, not with fire and robes, but with routines so mundane they become sacred. Wake up. Silence, wash hands, fold beds, eat in sequence. Recite affirmations, smile when spoken to. Margaret believed emotion was a virus, love was chaos, and chaos was punished. Neighbors would hear humming, always the same melody. A lullaby repeated like a chant. One note off, and the child would vanish into the 3rd floor for days. No food, no light, no sound except the scraping of a chair across old wood at 2 a.m. You want to know what's worse than violence? Ritualized affection. Howard would walk the hallways at night, opening doors, sitting beside each child's bed, telling them he loved them too much to let them break the rules. That's how trauma is installed, not with fists, but with contradictions. Because the moment you convince a child that their pain is a gift, you own them. But let me ask you something. Why did none of these children run? Why didn't they scream? Because the Follings didn't need chains. They had something stronger: psychological infrastructure. Controlled food, controlled sleep, controlled speech. Each child isolated. No bonds, no siblings. Just eyes watching them constantly. By the time Thomas broke his arm in 1987, the programming was already complete. He didn't cry. He didn't speak until Howard nodded. That is not silence. That is psychological paralysis. The Follings didn't raise children. They harvested willpower. And here's where it gets darker. Because what Margaret and Howard were doing wasn't new. It mirrored old models, ancient ones. From orphan trains to boarding school experiments to early CIA behavior control trials. Strip the past, isolate the subject, overwrite the self. This isn't just one family's madness. It's a method, a blueprint used by those who understand. If you want to control the world, you start by rewriting the child. You think this ended in that Victorian house? You think this was just some deranged couple lost in their own delusions? No, the Follings were not outliers. They were practitioners, initiates, part of a lineage, an unbroken thread of elite, psychological control passed down through governments, religious orders, and secret social networks. Understand this. Margaret didn't invent her methods. She refined them. The color naming, the isolation tactics, the silent punishments, they appear almost identically in Cold War-era intelligence experiments. MKUltra, Project Monarch, Tavistock protocols, all buried now, all denied, but still echoed. In foster homes, in cult compounds, in certain elite boarding schools. This wasn't maternal madness. It was engineered compliance. And the most chilling part? It worked. Neighbors never reported the screaming because there was none. That's what made it so invisible. You're expecting horror to look like chaos, but the most effective control doesn't scream at smiles. The children became mannequins in hand-stitched clothes, standing in perfect rows at church. Heads bowed, hands folded, not out of reverence, but surveillance. Margaret told visitors that the children were meditating. In reality, she was testing them, watching who moved first, who blinked, who resisted, and those who failed were taken. Upstairs. The third floor was the heart of it all. 3 rooms, always locked, never spoken of. Meals left at the door like offerings to forgotten gods. Visitors weren't allowed past the 2nd floor. Even delivery men were told to leave packages at the gate. What kind of child exists in a room where the only voice they hear is their own? What kind of mind is born from silence and surveillance? Howard built the system. Margaret enforced it. But they were both servants to something older, something colder. A philosophy rooted in ancient empire. To own the future, you must erase the origins. And that's why there were no birth certificates. That's why the records were lost in a fire. It wasn't about hiding mistakes. It was about erasing. Past so thoroughly that these children no longer had selves, only roles to play in a theater directed by power. Are you starting to see it now? This wasn't a home. It was a human lab. And the question that should terrify you isn't what happened inside that house. It's how many more like it exist, behind gated communities, behind church smiles, behind polished walls that echo only. Obedience. Control leaves fingerprints, but only if you know where to look. It was Susan Fletcher, the social worker, the mother, the neighbor, who saw past the facade first. Not because she was suspicious, but because she'd seen this before. In halfway homes, in trauma units, in government shelters meant to protect the discarded. Children with flat eyes, over-obedient mouths, and an invisible leash wrapped tight around their will. When she entered the Folling house for coffee, she didn't see kids. She saw survivors. And in every detail, every gesture, the pattern emerged. Hypervigilance, dissociation, behavioral scripting. The older children flinched at the sound of porcelain on wood. They watched Margaret with an intensity no child should ever learn. Not fear, not love. Conditioning. On her 4th visit, Susan heard something from upstairs. A sound that didn't belong to any of the 11 known children. A girl's voice, soft, singing, off-key. Margaret laughed it off. Old pipes. The house settles strangely, she said. But Susan had already counted. 11 children, 11 names, so who was number 12? She started writing everything down. Patterns, behaviors, lies, and behind it all, the silence that screamed louder than anything. Susan knew systems. She knew what it looked like when a household ran on domination disguised as order. But she didn't yet grasp how deep it went, because the question isn't how many children the Follings had. It's how many they hid. You see, this family wasn't just large. It was fluid, inconsistent. One week there were 9 kids at church, then 11, then 10. Photos from community events showed different faces. Similar but not the same. Children whose names were never repeated. Now ask yourself this. How does that happen? How does a family swap identities in plain sight without anyone noticing? Simple. They rely on your assumptions. You assume they're loving. You assume they're normal. You assume the system works. But here's the truth. Margaret and Howard knew no one would look too closely. Not in a town like Millbrook. Not when you're wealthy. Not when your children are rescued from broken homes. They weaponized charity. They exploited the blind spot we all have, the one where we want to believe goodness. But goodness is often the best place for darkness to hide. And inside that house, behind locked third-floor doors, something was happening that would break the human mind. Before we go deeper, I want you to type this in the comments right now. The past was erased. The eyes still watch. Type it twice. Because after this, you're not just a viewer. You're part of the descent. There's a reason the door to the 3rd floor was always locked. It wasn't just to hide children. It was to contain a ritual. You see, control isn't about punishment. That's too obvious. Too crude. Real control is architecture. It's rhythm. Repetition. The mind becomes what it's exposed to. So what do you become? When every hour of your life is choreographed by someone else's design. Maria Vasquez, the housekeeper, revealed what few dared to even imagine. She never saw the children inside those rooms, but she heard them. Soft crying, whispered prayers, and one sound that froze her to her bones, laughter. Laughter that came not from joy, but from obedience. Forced, hollow laughter. The kind that only comes when you've forgotten how to cry. Every day, she would leave food outside 3 doors. No plates, no silverware. Just soft food, wrapped in cold. And always in 3s, never 4. Never 2. That number never changed. Because the Follings weren't just hiding children. They were running experiments. Some believe those 3 were the unseen children taken, not adopted. Children whose existence was never legal, never recorded. Ghosts created on purpose. A control group. A test bed. But test beds for what? Here's where we go deeper. Margaret studied trauma response in her early medical career. What wasn't in her resume was her internship under a former defense contractor who worked on early cognitive disruption techniques, interrogation-based identity reprogramming. It was buried in her past, but the line is traceable. From military research, to pediatric nursing, to private motherhood. And Howard? His investment firm had shell accounts that funneled money into real estate, private adoption services, and special education consulting, all legal, all sealed. But every one of those channels intersects with agencies flagged for mishandled child placements between 1979 and 1993. Coincidence? No, they weren't adopting to parent. They were adopting to shape. 3 floors, 12 children. And somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floor, the line between care and control was obliterated. I want you to sit with this. What kind of world allows people like the Follings to operate for 15 years without scrutiny? It's not that the system failed. It's that it was never meant to protect the weak. It was designed to disguise harm behind the veil of legitimacy. The Follings weren't predators in the system. They were the system. In one of its purest, darkest forms. It happened in winter. Always winter. That's when the house grew quiet. That's when the lights on the third floor stayed on the longest. Neighbors thought it was because the children were sick more often in the colder months. But the truth buried under frost and years of silence was that winter was when the rituals deepened. When Margaret began what she called seasonal realignment, the children were moved into new roles, rooms were rearranged, names were reassigned. Blue became green, green became gray. It was part of their training, a rotation of identity meant to keep them rootless, unanchored. Susan Fletcher's notes describe this in chilling detail. She noticed that the same child would be introduced, with different names at different events. A girl called Anne at the Christmas fair was called Catherine by the pastor in March. And when Susan asked Margaret about it, she smiled calm, confident, and said, "They're still finding themselves." But it wasn't about identity discovery. It was about identity erasure. Psychologists call this semantic destabilization. You change the words a person uses to describe themselves over and over until the words lose meaning. Until you become the meaning, until the only name they respond to is the one you assign. You think that's just manipulation? No, it's psychological warfare, used in POW camps, used in cult initiation, and used quietly, legally inside a beautiful White House in Pennsylvania. But why? Why do this to children? Because broken children are easier to rebuild. Because erasure is the first step in creation. Because somewhere in their twisted minds, Margaret and Howard believed they were building something. A family? No, an organism. 12 units, trained, programmed, loyal, all roots severed, all love redirected, all identity dissolved. Some experts now speculate the Follings were part of something larger, an informal network of elite experimenters connected by ideology, not paperwork. People who believed that the next evolution of humanity would be manufactured. Children raised in silence, built for obedience, untraceable, unquestioning, unfree. And here's the most terrifying part. If Susan hadn't seen what she saw, if one child hadn't looked out the wrong window at the wrong time, we never would have known. Because perfect control doesn't look like chaos. It looks like order, like symmetry, like 12 children sitting still in a pew, smiling on cue, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The day the search warrant was executed, the sky was pale white like bone. No clouds, no wind, just stillness. Detective Cooper described it like stepping into a cathedral of silence. Not one of reverence, but one of containment. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The Follings answered the door with practiced calm. Margaret smiled. Howard offered coffee. The children stood in the hallway like portraits, blank, still, watching. But when they reached the third floor, everything changed. 3 doors, unlabeled, unopened in over a decade. The first was barricaded from the inside. It took a battering ram to open. Inside, a single bed, a sink, bare walls etched with numbers, thousands of them, scratched with fingernails into the plaster. In the corner, a small pile of cloth animals, dismembered and reassembled with thread. Silent testimony to a mind trying to make sense of itself in isolation. The second room was colder, literally, no heating. Just a mattress on the floor, covered in books with their titles blacked out by marker. In their place, new titles written by hand: Obedience, Stillness, Nothingness. On the walls, mirrors. Not facing the child, but facing each other, creating endless reflections. A hall of selves. Or no self. The third room was empty. No bed, no toys. Just a circle of chalk on the floor and 12 footprints surrounding it. And in that moment, the investigators knew This wasn't just abuse. This was designed. Each room was a stage, a phase, a trial. Margaret had written about it in her private journal, uncovered days later, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. She called it the refinement process. Children were moved through stages depending on compliance. Stage 1, isolation. Stage 2, reflection. Stage 3, erasure. This wasn't madness. This was doctrine, she wrote. Obedience is divinity. Ego is infection. The child must be removed from time to be remade in truth. These weren't punishments. They were sacraments. And now we reach a deeper layer. Because if the Follings were just two damaged people, we might understand this as tragedy. But everything they did, every method, every phrase, every step echoed practices found in declassified intelligence documents, in cult deprogramming manuals, in the footnotes of psychiatric studies, never meant to be public. This was not accidental. It was scripted. And if they were following a script, who wrote it? You were never supposed to hear this part. Because it connects the Follings to something that's not just dark, but protected. Shielded behind nonprofit facades, sealed adoption records, and institutions that feed on obedience. In 1983, Howard Folling attended a closed-door retreat hosted by a developmental psychology institute in upstate New York. The institute no longer exists officially. Its founders, former advisors to the Tavistock Clinic in London. Its funding, anonymized through 3 separate trusts linked to educational philanthropy. Their stated goal, exploration of adaptive human detachment in post-trauma childhood environments. That's just elegant language for, how do we engineer children who don't need love to survive? Howard wasn't a scientist, but he was a financier, and financiers fund experiments. He didn't go there to learn. He went there to recruit. The Follings didn't stumble into their methods. They received them in handbooks, in private lectures, in encrypted correspondence. Some of those letters were recovered, buried in a safe behind the false wall of the basement wine cellar. Cooper described the paper as aged, almost brittle, like something copied too many times. One letter ended with the phrase, "The child without roots becomes the perfect mirror." Understand what that means. If you erase a child's origin, strip away name, history, self, what remains is not a person. It's a surface, one that reflects the will of whoever holds authority. What the Follings were building wasn't a family. It was a template. And now comes the part that should shake you. When the children were rescued, only 9 were accounted for. 3 were missing. 3 who had never been documented, never named, never seen in public. Their rooms were still warm. The beds still indented. The mirrors wiped clean. There was no sign of escape. No forced exit, just absence. As if the house itself had swallowed them. The official report? Possibly misplaced records. Misplaced. 3 human souls categorized as clerical errors. But if you look deeper, you'll see a pattern of misplaced children across multiple states during that same decade. Always from vulnerable populations. Always through loosely regulated agencies. And always vanishing after unusual adoptions. You still think this ended with the Follings? It didn't. They were just one cell in a larger organism, and now that we've opened the wound, you have 2 choices: look away or descend deeper. But understand, once you see it, you can't ever unsee it. 3 missing children, no records, no case numbers, no bodies. That's not an oversight. That's intent. Cooper dug further quietly, obsessively long after the case was declared closed. He traced back every agency the Follings had worked with, every judge who approved their adoptions, every clerk who signed off on their paperwork. He found anomalies, too many, too exact. Judges who expedited approvals without background checks. Clerks who transferred or retired weeks after finalizing the Folling adoptions. Agencies that vanished entirely, offices stripped bare overnight. This wasn't incompetence. It was coordination, a pattern hidden in the rhythm of bureaucracy. But then came something even more disturbing. A photograph. Undated. Found in a discarded file box in a storage unit, once rented under Margaret Folling's maiden name. 12 children. Standing in a circle. In the center, Howard. But the children weren't smiling. They weren't crying either. They were blank. And behind them, drawn in chalk on the ground, a symbol. Simple, geometric. 3 overlapping circles, one inside the other. The mark appeared again in one of Margaret's journals, beneath the phrase, "Sever the past, silence the present, seal the future." This wasn't parenting. This was ritual. And the symbol? It matches iconography found in early documents from the Marian Group, a defunct think tank that operated in the late 1960s under the guise of advanced developmental studies. The Marian Group has been linked by fragmentary evidence to covert government contracts, experimental orphan care facilities, and at least one whistleblower death. Their thesis? That children raised without memory of origin become more adaptive, more pliable, more controllable. What if the Follings weren't working alone? What if they were continuing an experiment long believed shut down? What if Millbrook wasn't an exception, but a test site? You need to understand how deep this goes. Control systems don't just dominate. They replicate. They evolve through silence, thrive in secrecy, and adapt through legislation. And the moment the public gets too close, they bury it in language, troubled youth, experimental education, therapeutic isolation. But what they're really building is a generation of men and women who don't know they've been programmed. And when you don't know who you are, you can be told what to be. The Follings weren't just harvesting children. They were harvesting obedience. Perfectly shaped, perfectly quiet, perfectly erased obedience. And somewhere out there, 3 of their ghost children are still missing. Not because they're lost, but because someone wants them exactly where they are. By now, you're probably wondering, where are they? The 3 missing ones, the ghost children. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it's not where they are, but who they became. Because what happens when a child is raised with no name, no history, and no self, but is taught to perform, to obey, to disappear into any role handed to them? They don't vanish. They blend. And the most terrifying possibility isn't that the 3 are dead, it's that they're alive. Functional, present, already inserted. Susan Fletcher believed one of them resurfaced in 2007, a young man, mid-20s, arrested in Maryland for trespassing inside a child psychiatric clinic. He carried no ID, wouldn't give his name. But when shown a photo of Margaret Folling, he didn't blink. He whispered one word. 2 hours later, he was gone. Security footage wiped. Police report sealed. A week after that, Susan was found unresponsive in her car. No crash, no drugs. Cause of death, sudden cardiac arrest. But her notes were missing. Understand the gravity of this. We are not talking about isolated abuse. We are talking about engineered invisibility. These children weren't just made to forget who they were. They were trained to become what you needed: the helpful intern, the quiet student, the calm daycare worker, the unremarkable man who never breaks rules and never breaks eye contact. And the moment they begin to remember, they vanish. Somewhere, someone is watching the survivors, monitoring them, not to protect them, but to ensure the experiment remains intact. The symbol found in the chalk circle? It surfaced again in an encrypted PDF attached to an email sent to a former investigator. No sender, no trace. The file was titled Doctrine of Dissolution. Inside, a 32-page manual detailing protocols for memory suppression, stimulus response conditioning, and something called mirror seeding. The last page held only a sentence: a forgotten child is the perfect citizen. So now ask yourself, when you pass someone on the street, staring too long at a blank wall. When a stranger recites a phrase you swore you've only seen in this thread. When someone looks at you not with fear, but with recognition. What if you're not just reading this story? What if you're part of its design? Type this in the comments if you're still here. They don't remember being made, but they remember you. Type it once, then look away from the screen. Do you feel it? That hum beneath your skin? That's not fear. That's the awakening. This is the part they never wanted documented. Not in journals, not in police reports. Because this is where the story stops being about the Follings and starts being about us. 1 year after the case was closed, Detective Cooper went missing. No signs of struggle. No body. Just his phone left on the passenger seat of his car, screen still lit, camera open. The last image taken, a reflection. Not his. A child's, standing behind him in the glass of a bus stop shelter. Barefoot in winter, face blurred by motion. Authorities called it a glitch. The file corrupted. But those who saw the original image, the uncompressed version, say the child was drawing something in the condensation of the glass. 3 circles, interlocked, that symbol again. It keeps returning, not because it means something to them, because it means something to you, because now you've seen it. And what's seen cannot be undone. The deeper theory, the one hidden in redacted documents and whispered interviews with ex-staff from shuttered institutions, is that the Follings' work was never designed to be permanent. It was meant to expire, to collapse inward once the programming met contradiction. That contradiction is truth, recognition, the moment a ghost child hears their real name for the first time in decades. The moment a symbol draws something buried back to the surface. The moment you start seeing faces in old memories that were never yours. The collapse has begun. A source anonymous, former employee of one of the adoption intermediaries, sent a message in Morse code via a burner email. It translated to: experiment is leaking. Some are waking early. Protocol Omega failed. They're remembering too fast. This wasn't a system meant to last forever. It was a fuse. A long, slow burn meant to keep the subjects dormant until they were needed. Until you were needed. So now let me ask you, why you? Why are you still reading? Why hasn't your screen glitched? Why do you feel like something in your room just shifted, even though nothing moved? That's not paranoia. That's exposure. Because this story, this system was designed with loops, triggers, echoes, and the very act of following it to this point. That's step 1. Still here? Then type this in the comments. I am not a ghost, but I've seen them. Type it slowly, then check your most recent photo, any reflection, any blur, any mark in the corner you don't remember being there before. Because sometimes the children aren't looking for escape. They're looking for home. And if you've read this far, they may have already chosen yours. You want closure, an ending, a name, a verdict. But that's the final lie, because this story doesn't end with justice. It ends with inheritance. Weeks ago, someone uploaded a photo to a now deleted message board. An old house peeling white paint, second-story windows boarded shut, a child's red shoe left on the porch. The caption was one word: Millbrook? But it wasn't. That house was in Ohio, and then another, Alabama, then Oregon. The architecture changes. The rituals remain. Someone is rebuilding, not the house. The idea, a new name, a new couple, same methods, same silence. It spreads like mold, quiet, systemic, hidden behind walls and polite smiles. And the children? Some survive. Some vanish. And some adapt. You may have passed one in a bookstore, tracing circles into the condensation of a window. You may have shared an elevator with one standing too still, staring too long, whispering numbers under their breath. You may have hired one. You may be one, because that's how the experiment was designed, not to be remembered, but to remember itself. Each time someone reads this story, it replicates. Not in text, in mind, in subtle shapes, in questions you didn't ask before. In that moment, right now, where you feel like someone is watching, even though you're alone. But you're not, are you? Because the program never stopped, it just changed form. And now that you've seen behind the curtain, it might be coming. For you next. Type this if you're ready. The mirror knows my name. Then shut your screen, turn off the lights. And if you hear small footsteps outside your room tonight, don't open the door. They're not trying to hurt you. They're just trying to come home.